Axel Rudakubana. Imagine sending your child to a summer dance class, the kind of morning that feels perfectly ordinary. A packed lunch, a bright outfit, maybe a friendship bracelet kit tucked under their arm. The theme is their favorite singer. The room is full of other children their age, laughing, moving, full of life. You kiss them goodbye at the door. You have no reason to feel afraid. Why would you? It is a dance class. It is a Monday morning in July. It is Southport. Now imagine getting the phone call. On the morning of July 29, 2024, 26 children between the ages of 6 and 11 arrived at the Hart Space, a small community dance studio on Hart Street in Southport, England. The event was a Taylor Swift-themed yoga and dance workshop, a sold-out summer activity for the very youngest and most innocent members of their community. Parents had signed permission slips. Teachers had prepared routines. No one in that building had any reason to believe that the morning would end in national mourning. But somewhere across town, a 17-year-old boy named Axel Rudakubana was already in a taxi. He was wearing a green hoodie and a surgical mask. Tucked beneath his clothing was an 8-inch kitchen knife he had purchased online 2 weeks earlier. He had one destination. He had one purpose. He arrived, walked calmly through the door, and began to stab the children. What followed inside that studio was so violent, so methodical, and so utterly without mercy that the presiding judge at his eventual trial would describe it as sitting at the extreme level of crime. Rudakubana moved through the room with terrifying purpose, targeting the smallest bodies he could reach. 6-year-old baby King sustained at least 122 separate stab wounds. 7-year-old Elsie Stancombe suffered 85. 9-year-old Alice da Silva Aguiar staggered out of the building onto the street, collapsed, and fought for her life for 14 hours before losing that fight. 2 adults who attempted to physically stop him, dance instructor Leanne Lucas and a passing businessman named Jonathan Hayes, were stabbed multiple times in the attempt. The judge would later say, with chilling certainty, that had Rudakubana not been physically stopped, he would have killed all 26 children in that room. When police arrived, he dropped the knife and cooperated. He did not run. He did not resist. He simply stopped. And in the hours that followed his arrest, he made a series of unsolicited statements that removed any doubt about the nature of what he had done. "I'm glad those children are dead," he told officers. "It makes me happy. It's a good thing those children are dead." In the weeks and months that followed, a devastating picture began to emerge, not just of what Rudakubana had done, but of how many chances the system had been given to stop him. Between the ages of 13 and 14, he had been referred to the United Kingdom's Prevent Counter-Radicalization program 3 separate times. Lancashire police had responded to 5 separate calls from his home address about his behavior. He had been referred to mental health services, children's social care, and a youth offending team. He had been convicted of a violent assault on another child at school. A head teacher had explicitly warned colleagues that he needed to be regularly searched for knives and described him in writing as sinister, cold, and calculating. His own family had created what investigators later called significant obstacles in accessing the help he so clearly needed. Every door that should have opened did not. Every warning that should have been heard was not. He was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, though the diagnosis was never used as an explanation for what he did. Investigators found that he had possessed an Al-Qaeda instruction manual and had successfully produced ricin, a lethal biological toxin, inside his bedroom. He had no known terrorist ideology. No manifesto was discovered. No political cause was identified. The prosecution suggested, in chilling simplicity, that the motive may have been mass murder as an end in itself. Not rage, not grievance, just destruction. On January 23, 2025, Axel Rudakubana stood before Liverpool Crown Court and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, possession of a bladed article, production of a biological toxin, and possession of terrorist material. He was 18 years old. Justice Julian Goose sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 52 years. The longest minimum term ever handed to a juvenile offender in British legal history. The judge stated plainly that it was highly likely Rudakubana would never be released. Bebby King was 6 years old. Elsie Stancombe was 7. Alice da Silva Aguiar was 9. They went to a dance class on a Monday morning in July, and they never came home. Leighton Ames. He told police he had taken the knife from his kitchen that evening for reassurance. That was the word he used, reassurance. As though a 14-year-old boy walking to a park with his girlfriend simply needed the comfort of a serrated blade tucked into his jacket pocket. It was a story built on the idea that the knife was defensive, that it was there just in case, that the boy who carried it was not someone to be feared, but someone who was afraid. The jury did not believe it. And once the full picture of Leighton Ames began to emerge, the school exclusions, the images on his phone, the words he shouted in the seconds after the stabbing, the idea that he carried that knife out of fear became very difficult to sustain. Tomasz Oleszak was 14 years old on the night of October 3, 2022. He had been born in Poland in 2007 and moved to Gateshead with his family in 2012. He was, by every account given by those who knew him, a boy of exceptional character, bright, kind, gifted, a passionate footballer and basketball player who was described by his family as respectful and gentle, a boy who hated violence. He was just days away from his 15th birthday. That evening he was at White Hills Nature Park in Gateshead, part of a group of young people in the same space on an autumn night. He crossed paths with Leighton Ames. Ames was also 14. He was in the park with his girlfriend when, he claimed, a group of youths began following them and then attacked him, punching and kicking him to the ground. He said he pulled the knife in self-defense, in a moment of panic, with no intention of killing anyone. That account was the foundation of his defense, and the jury considered it carefully. They rejected it. What the evidence showed, and what witnesses confirmed, was a different sequence entirely. Ames had armed himself before leaving home. He had taken a serrated kitchen knife and placed it in his body warmer pocket, not grabbed it from a drawer in a moment of desperation, but carried it deliberately into a public space. When the confrontation escalated, he used it. He stabbed Tomasz Oleszak once, in the chest. The wound was 8 centimeters deep, entering just above the heart and severing the main artery leading out of it. It was a single blow, and it was fatal. What happened immediately after told the court, and the watching public, something essential about the boy who delivered it. Ames turned toward the group and shouted at them. The words he used translated colloquially as a declaration that he had stabbed one of their number. The judge at sentencing would describe the statement as triumphant. A friend Ames contacted shortly after the attack confirmed the tone. He told that friend he had stabbed someone. He asked if the friend knew a good place to hide the knife and bury it. The friend later said Ames had been bouncing, happy, unbothered. It didn't faze him at all, the statement read. When police examined Ames's phone after his arrest, they found images that confirmed what was already becoming clear. He had what the judge described as an unhealthy and malign interest in knives. It was not a new development. At primary school, he had been excluded for threatening to stab a teacher. At secondary school, he had been excluded for arson after setting fire to a plastic window frame. This was not a boy who had arrived at violence suddenly. This was a boy for whom violence had been a language for years, and who on the night of October 3rd had carried the means to make it permanent. Tomasz's mother, Kamila Wisniewska, was called to the scene of the stabbing that night. In her victim impact statement, she told the court she still had flashbacks to those moments, trying desperately to keep her boy alive on the ground of a park in Gateshead. Tomasz died shortly after. He was described in court as bright, exceptional, and gifted. The judge, addressing Ames directly at sentencing, told him, "This was the beautiful, exceptional, gifted boy whose life you, Leighton, brought to an end." On June 15, 2023, Leighton Ames was sentenced to life detention with a minimum term of 12 years. He was 15 years old at sentencing. He had been 14 when he killed Tomasz. A detective who led the investigation said afterward that the case should send an unequivocal message to any young person who believes that carrying a weapon is acceptable. He said the consequences could be devastating, that you could take away someone else's future, destroy the lives of their loved ones, and ruin your own life and those of your family all at once. Tomasz Oleszak's family are living that consequence every day. His mother described it simply. They are facing, she said, The worst sentence of all. A life without Tomasz. Seandell Jackson, murder during robbery. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July 6, 2009. Life without parole. There is a question that haunts every courtroom where a teenager stands accused of taking a life. It is a question without a clean answer, one that judges, juries, and entire legal systems have wrestled with for generations. At what point does a young person become fully accountable for the worst thing they have ever done? At what age does the law stop seeing a child and start seeing a killer? And what do we do with a 17-year-old boy who shoots an unarmed man dead during a robbery, then goes home, sits down, and plays video games? Nathan Potter was 21 years old on the night of July 6, 2009. He was a film student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, described by everyone who knew him as a gentle, free-spirited young man with a bright future stretched out ahead of him. He had been at a bar that evening in the River West neighborhood, not far from his apartment. He left sometime after 1 in the morning and began the short walk home. He had no reason to feel threatened. He could not have known that 2 figures had been watching that neighborhood since the night before, or that they had already been reported to police as suspicious, or that those same 2 figures had been quietly stalking him from the moment he stepped outside. Seandell Jackson was 18 years old. His companion, Derek Thomas, acted as a lookout. When they approached Nathan Potter and demanded his money, Potter had none to give. He had nothing on him. He was a college student walking home at night. Jackson pulled the trigger anyway. Nathan Potter died in that parking lot, leaving behind a family that would never recover. Jackson and Thomas walked away from the scene, returned to Thomas's home, and spent the rest of the night playing video games. Hours later, Jackson shot a second person, a man he saw involved in an argument with a woman on the street. That victim survived. Jackson was later taken into custody by United States Marshals in Gulfport, Mississippi, after a tip from his own uncle. Thomas was arrested separately and told investigators everything. The trial that followed produced evidence that was as clear as it was damning. Jackson was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, attempted armed robbery, and first-degree recklessly endangering safety. But it was not the verdict that seared itself into public memory. It was what happened in the courtroom when that verdict was read. As the judge announced the findings, Jackson appeared briefly to have tears in his eyes. But the moment passed. What replaced it was something that left the victim's family breathless with fury. Jackson turned to face them. He looked directly at Nathan Potter's parents with an expression that witnesses described as taunting, almost proud. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he glanced back and smiled. The display was so provocative that at his sentencing months later, when he again attempted to turn toward the Potter family, court deputies physically restrained him. Members of his own family, seated in the gallery, screamed and cursed at the victim's family. It was, by every account, a scene of extraordinary ugliness. At that sentencing, Nathan Potter's parents told the judge that Seandell Jackson should never again be free. Jackson himself addressed the court and asked for leniency. The judge was unmoved. He called Jackson a threat to the public and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the attempted robbery and the non-fatal shooting earlier that same day. What followed was years of legal arguments about whether that sentence was constitutional. Jackson had been 17 and a half at the time of the crimes, technically a juvenile under the lens of subsequent Supreme Court rulings that questioned the fairness of mandatory life without parole sentences for those who committed crimes before turning 18. His attorneys argued that the sentence violated his constitutional rights. Courts at multiple levels reviewed the case. Each time, the sentence was upheld. Judges consistently found that Jackson's conduct, the cold calculation of the robbery, the indifference with which he returned home and played video games, the contemptuous behavior in the courtroom, placed him firmly among the narrow category of juvenile offenders whose crimes reflected not youthful impulsivity, but something far more entrenched. The judge at his original sentencing had called him a threat to the public. Years of appeals did not change that assessment. Nathan Potter's brother, who was autistic, was so traumatized by his sibling's killing that he became unable to be in a dark room. He began insisting that every light in the house remain on at all times. He asked for the windows to be removed. He could not explain why. He only knew that the world no longer felt safe in the way it once had, and that his brother, who had walked home one summer night and never arrived, was never coming back. Seandell Jackson remains in a Wisconsin correctional facility, serving a sentence with no end date. He will die in prison. Beyonce Stroud murder/attempted murder. Gateshead, England, April 27, 2024. Life, minimum 20 years. She never held the knife. She was not inside the house when Gary Belfield took his last breath. She was standing outside, in the dark, watching. That single fact became the center of her defense. The argument her legal team built their entire case around. She was 15 years old. She was just a girl. She was not the one who did it. But when the judge at Newcastle Crown Court looked down at Krisha Beyonce Stroud and prepared to deliver his remarks, he made something crystal clear. Without you, he told her, none of this would have happened. The story begins with a dog. In the spring of 2024, Stroud became consumed by a dispute over an animal she believed rightfully belonged to her half-sister Courtney, who had recently ended a relationship with 40-year-old Gary Belfield. The dog was living at Gary's flat in Felling, Gateshead. Stroud wanted it back. What started as a grievance over a pet escalated, in the mind of a 15-year-old girl, into something far more serious. She began telling people that Gary was a danger to her family. She stoked anger. She recruited. And on the evening of April 27, 2024, she put her plan into motion. She enlisted 2 boys, Leandro Lopez and Jordan Tams, both 17, and the 3 of them traveled together to Gary's address. They watched from outside as Gary and his son, 21-year-old Luke Williams, arrived home. They saw the lights come on. They knew the flat was occupied. A conversation happened between the 3 of them about whether to proceed. They proceeded. Lopes and Tams pulled on masks, produced knives, and went inside. What followed was a scene of savage violence. Luke Williams was at the sitting room doorway when one of the masked men approached and struck him in the face. He was then stabbed, in the arm, the side, the back. He fought desperately, trying to grab the knife from his attacker, sustaining deep cuts to his hands in the struggle. As he was being stabbed, he could see the second masked figure repeatedly plunging a blade into his father. He was forced to abandon Gary in that room and run for help. He staggered bleeding to a nearby garage, screaming for assistance. When he got outside, he saw Stroud standing there. She had not gone in. She had simply waited. Gary Belfield was stabbed 11 times. He died in his own living room. He was 40 years old and the father of 6 children. In the days after the killing, Stroud told people she had watched the attack through the window. She said it casually, almost boastfully. Prosecutors later demonstrated that the window in question had a blind covering it and she could not have seen anything through it. But the statement itself spoke volumes about her state of mind. She was not horrified by what had happened. She was not racked with guilt. She was narrating it to others as though it were something to recount. The trial at Newcastle Crown Court lasted 4 weeks. All 3 defendants denied murder and attempted murder. Stroud's legal team argued that she had not actively encouraged or assisted in the killing, that she had only intended to retrieve a dog and had not foreseen the deadly outcome. The prosecution argued otherwise. They presented evidence of her planning, her recruitment of the 2 older boys, and her conduct before and after the attack. They showed that when Gary and Luke arrived at the flat that evening, all 3 defendants had been given the opportunity to walk away. They chose not to. The jury convicted all 3 of murder and attempted murder. In January 2025, they were sentenced at Newcastle Crown Court. Lopes and Tams each received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. Stroud, as the youngest and as the organizer who remained outside the flat, received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Her defense had painted a picture of a deeply damaged child. She had been using cannabis since the age of 8. She had grown up without structure, without boundaries, having witnessed and experienced violence throughout her childhood. Her barrister told the court that since being held on remand, she had experienced, perhaps for the first time, routine, warmth, regular meals, and education. It was a portrait of a child failed long before April 24th. The judge acknowledged her background. He acknowledged her age, And then he made clear that none of it absolved her of what she had set in motion. She had organized the break-in. She had armed the boys who carried it out. She had stood outside and let it happen. A 40-year-old man died. His son nearly died alongside him. Krisha Beyonce Stroud was 15 years old. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until her mid-30s at the earliest. Camila Shayla Hernandez Rivas. Murder by stabbing it began the way so many teenage conflicts begin, with a comment at a party, a spiral of text messages, and two girls who decided the only way to settle it was with their fists. 14-year-old Chloe Edwards agreed to a fight. She showed up at the address she had been given, her older sister driving her there, her friends beside her. She believed she was walking into a fistfight. She did not walk back out. The conflict between Chloe Edwards and Shayla Hernandez Rivas had its roots in an incident at a party sometime before February of 2023 in Reno, Nevada. Hernandez Rivas had made a comment about Chloe. It spread. It festered. The two girls, both students in the North Valleys area, began exchanging hostile messages on social media. The messages escalated until they reached the point that teenagers sometimes reach, when words feel insufficient and a physical confrontation feels like the only resolution. They agreed to meet at Hernandez Rivas's home on Soft Winds Drive. A fistfight. A settlement. That was the agreement. What Chloe Edwards did not know was that the girl waiting for her had already decided the fight would not be fair. On February 19, 2023, Chloe arrived with her sister Alexis and a friend. The confrontation began. Within seconds, witnesses and video footage would later confirm it happened almost immediately. Hernandez Rivas produced a knife and swung it 3 times. One blow struck Chloe in the chest, puncturing her heart and her left lung. Chloe's friends and family rushed her into a car and drove frantically to her home around the corner. She collapsed in the front yard. Emergency responders arrived and fought to save her life. They could not. Chloe Edwards was 14 years old. She died outside her own home, having survived the fight itself only to succumb to the wound within minutes of leaving the scene. When Reno police officers arrived at Hernandez Rivas's address, they found something that would make the prosecution's case almost impossible to argue against: surveillance video and cell phone recordings of the fight itself. Every moment was captured: the knife, the swing, the moment Chloe fell, and then, as Chloe was being rushed away in a car toward what would become her final moments, officers recording the scene captured Hernandez Rivas on body cam. Chloe was in an ambulance fighting for her life. Hernandez Rivas, according to the prosecutor at her sentencing, was heard to say, "I got that bitch." The legal proceedings that followed carried a weight made heavier by the ages involved. Hernandez Rivas was 14 at the time of the killing, 15 by the time she faced sentencing. A criminal and forensic psychologist who evaluated her testified that she had a mental age of 11 at the time of the crime and had been diagnosed with depression in August 2022, just months before the stabbing. She had a troubled background and a difficult upbringing. Her public defender asked for the maximum 50-year sentence, but with parole eligibility after 13 years, citing her youth and psychological state. Chloe's sister Alexis, who had driven her to the fight, stood before the court and addressed Hernandez Rivas directly. "I don't want revenge," she said. "Just justice and peace. I hope you see where I'm coming from and the life I now have to live because of your actions." She had been there. She had watched her 14-year-old sister arrive for a fistfight. She had driven her home afterward, not understanding yet that the wound was fatal. She had stood in that front yard. The weight of that day would follow her forever. Chloe's mother had spent months before the stabbing personally escorting her daughter to and from school because of ongoing bullying. She had known something was wrong. In hindsight, she would say she wished she had checked Chloe's phone before that February afternoon, that she would have stopped her from walking out the front door. But she also wondered whether Chloe would simply have gone alone. In December 2023, Hernandez Rivas pleaded guilty to the charge of challenging to fight with a deadly weapon resulting in death. Because of her age, the court was legally barred from sentencing her to life without parole or the death penalty. The judge, Kathleen Draculich, was presented with a sentencing range and had to weigh every competing factor: the youth of the offender, the coldness of the act, The video evidence, the words spoken afterward, and the family of a 14-year-old girl who would never come home again. On February 22, 2024, Judge Draculich handed down the maximum sentence available under Nevada law. Shayla Hernandez Rivas was sentenced to 50 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 20 years. She sat quietly throughout the proceedings, her long hair falling across her face, never once turning to look at the people seated behind her. She will be in her mid-30s before she is eligible to ask for her freedom. Chloe Edwards never got the chance to reach that age. Konrad Schafer. Most people who grew up in Kissimmee, Florida in the summer of 2013 remember it as a season of fear. For 2 weeks in June and July of that year, gunshots rang out across Osceola County with no apparent pattern and no apparent reason. Homes were hit. Cars were hit. 22 separate shootings rattled a community that had no idea who was responsible or when it would stop. Residents stayed indoors. Parents kept their children close. Police worked the case around the clock, searching for a perpetrator they could not yet identify. When they finally found him, what they discovered defied easy comprehension. The person at the center of the terror was not a hardened criminal with a long history of violence. He was a 15-year-old boy, and when investigators asked him why he had done it, the answer he gave them was as chilling as anything else about the case. He said shooting people would be fun. Konrad Schafer had not had an easy childhood. He was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 8 and spent years undergoing treatment, losing his hair, gaining weight from medication, enduring the kind of physical and emotional ordeal that no child should face. His mother, who was deaf, later testified through a sign language interpreter that he had been bullied relentlessly at school because of how he looked during and after those treatments. She said she had begged school officials to provide him counseling. It never came. Doctors had warned the family that the medications could alter his behavior, making him more emotional and volatile. By his mid-teens, whatever damage had been done, by illness, by bullying, by a system that failed to intervene, had calcified into something darker. In the early summer of 2013, Schafer convinced his father to buy him a gun and 100 rounds of ammunition. His father complied. At night, after his father went to sleep, Schafer would take the weapon out of the house. He went out with friends, a group that included David Damas, Victoria Rios, and Juan Muriel. Together they drove through Kissimmee and Poinciana, firing into random homes and vehicles. No targets were selected for any reason. No grudges were being settled. The shootings were, by every account, carried out purely for the experience of doing them. On June 26, 2013, 17-year-old David Guerrero left his home before dawn to catch a bus to work. He was a student at Osceola High School. He had a job. He had a future. As he waited at the bus stop, a car passed and Schafer opened fire. David Guerrero was shot and killed on a Kissimmee street at sunrise, on his way to earn a living, chosen by no other criteria than that he happened to be there. Days later, Schafer and his associates forced their way into the Poinciana home of 22-year-old Eric Rupnarine, a college student and club promoter who was studying to fulfill his dream of working on Wall Street. Rupnarine begged for his life. He was shot and then had his throat cut. His grandfather later stood in court and told the judge there was no happiness left in his family. "We will never see that bright smile on his face again," he said. "We will never get to celebrate his graduation." Schafer was arrested in July 2013 alongside his 3 associates. He was 15 years old. He spent the next several years in the legal system before pleading guilty, at age 18, to 2 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing in April 2016, he stood before the court in an orange jumpsuit and addressed the families of his victims in a low voice. He told them he knew they would never forgive him and that he did not expect them to. The state attorney, Jeff Ashton, told the judge he did not believe the apology was genuine. He called Schafer a sociopath. He said that locking him away for the remainder of his life was the only way to guarantee the community's safety. The judge agreed. Konrad Schafer was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, 1 for each murder. Because he had been a juvenile at the time of the killings, the law entitled him to a sentencing review after 25 years, at which point his sentence could potentially be shortened. That hearing, if it occurs as scheduled, will take place in 2041. David Guerrero was 17. He was going to work. Eric Rupnarine was 22. He was going to college. Neither of them had any connection to Konrad Schafer. Neither of them had done anything to deserve what happened to them. They were simply in the wrong place, on the wrong street, during the 2 weeks that a 15-year-old boy with a gun decided that taking a life was something he wanted to experience. The judge at sentencing put it simply and without flinching. Schafer's acts, he said, exhibited an absolute indifference to the lives and rights of others, a total disregard for human life. There is no better way to say it than that. Logan MacPhail. Murder of ex-girlfriend. Hexham, England. January 27, 2023. Life. Minimum 17 years. Think about what it means to feel safe in a relationship. To meet someone through a shared hobby. To spend 18 months building something that feels like connection. To trust another person with your time, your affection, your sense of the future. Now think about what happens when that trust is slowly, quietly turned against you. When the person you are with starts changing your passwords. When they threaten to harm themselves if you try to leave. When they tell you they can hack your accounts, read your messages, find you wherever you go. When you are 13, 14, 15 years old, and the relationship you thought was normal turns out to be something else entirely. And then think about this. What if, the day you finally tried to get help, it was already too late? Holly Newton was 15 years old when she met Logan MacPhail at Army Cadets in the north of England. She was described by her mother as happy, funny, and full of life, a sporty teenager who loved dancing, was a quiet and dedicated student, and adored her pet cat. MacPhail was 16. The relationship they began seemed, at first, like a typical teenage romance. But over the 18 months that followed, Holly's family watched something shift. MacPhail became controlling. He changed her social media passwords and made her believe he could monitor her accounts. He threatened to harm himself when she tried to create distance. He tracked her movements. Holly's mother, Makala Trussler, became increasingly convinced that her daughter was the victim of domestic abuse, though Holly was still under 16 years old and had never been in a relationship before. Holly eventually ended things. MacPhail could not accept it. In the days leading up to January 27, 2023, Holly began sending alarmed messages to friends. She had heard MacPhail was planning to find her. The day before he killed her, he traveled from his home in Gateshead, more than 30 miles away, to Holly's hometown of Haltwhistle and showed up at her house. Police were called and escorted him away. Makala Trussler contacted officers and arranged a formal meeting for the following afternoon to discuss her fears about his behavior. She believed her daughter was in danger. On the morning of January 27th, Holly went to school in Hexham, unaware that MacPhail had already caught 2 buses to get there. He carried a knife inside his school backpack. He dressed in all black, wearing a snood and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. For more than an hour, CCTV cameras across the town center recorded him moving through the streets, following Holly and her friends from a distance, ducking out of sight whenever he risked being seen, lying to her about his whereabouts in a phone call he made during the pursuit. He was methodical. He was patient. The prosecution would later tell the court that he was perfectly capable of making rational choices. Holly sent a message to a friend that morning. She knew something was wrong. She had asked her mother to push back the police meeting until later that evening, so she could spend time with her friends after school. Makala Trussler would later describe that decision as the biggest mistake of her life. At around 5 in the afternoon, Holly came face to face with MacPhail outside a pizza shop in the town center. They exchanged words. He led her into a nearby alleyway. What happened next lasted less than 60 seconds. MacPhail stabbed Holly 36 times. A teenage friend who tried to intervene was stabbed 4 times in the attempt before managing to survive. Holly was rushed to hospital. She died in the emergency room. She was 15 years old. MacPhail was arrested at the scene, detained by members of the public who had witnessed the attack. Officers described him as calm and emotionless. When he was told during his arrest that he was facing a murder charge, his response was a single question: "Is she dead?" When he was asked to identify his victim, he gave her name and then added, almost casually, that she had been too horrible to him. At trial, His defense argued that he had never intended to kill Holly, that he had brought the knife to take his own life, and that he had blacked out during the attack. Psychiatrists raised questions about his fitness to stand trial, given his autism and learning difficulties. The prosecution countered by pointing to everything the CCTV had captured: the planning, the disguise, the hour of silent surveillance, the lies told during a phone call mid-pursuit. The jury rejected his account entirely and convicted him of murder. On November 1, 2024, Logan MacPhail was sentenced to life detention with a minimum term of 17 years. Holly's mother told the court she had been unable to hold her dying daughter in hospital because Holly's body was a crime scene. He will be eligible for parole consideration in his early 30s. Holly Newton will always be 15. Samantha Heath. When we try to understand how an 18-year-old girl comes to drive her friend into a state park and stab her 16 times, we inevitably ask one question before all others. Why? What could possibly motivate such an act? What kind of hatred? What kind of rage? What kind of darkness inside a person produces that outcome? But in the case of Samantha Heath, the answer to that question is not rage and it is not hatred. It is something that in some ways is more disturbing than either. The answer is love, or rather, what a young woman had been manipulated into believing was love, by a man 3 years her senior who had been quietly reshaping her sense of reality since she was 15 years old. Samantha Heath was a teenager from Barnstead, New Hampshire, when she met Kyle Buffum in 2012. He was 19. She was 15. Her parents recognized the age gap as a problem and tried to end the relationship. Buffum responded by purchasing a secret cell phone so the two could stay in contact without her parents' knowledge. When Heath turned 16, he asked her to move in with him. She did. By the time she was 18, she was living with him in a duplex apartment, entirely dependent on a relationship that had been built on isolation and control from its very foundation. Andrea Halverson was Heath's friend, a young woman the same age as Heath, someone she knew well enough to spend time with, well enough to invite for a drive. Buffum had decided that Andrea was a problem. He told Heath that Andrea was driving a wedge between them, pulling Heath's attention and loyalty away from him. Over the course of several months, through a relentless stream of text messages, investigators would later recover more than 70 pages of them, Buffum worked on Samantha Heath. He told her what needed to be done. He told her how to do it. He sent detailed instructions about how to stab a person and how to dispose of a body afterward. He had also identified a second target, a man named Luther, with a plan to then rob a string of gas stations and flee to Florida. It was not a plan born of passion. It was a plan, constructed in writing, over weeks and months, by a man who had spent years making a teenager believe that whatever he wanted was what she should want too. On January 26, 2014, Samantha Heath picked up Andrea Halverson and drove her to Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown. She lured her into an isolated area of the woods. She then pulled a knife and stabbed Andrea 16 times, in the chest, the stomach, the back, and the arm. A passing car appeared on a nearby road. Heath left. She left Andrea bleeding in the snow and drove away. Andrea Halverson did not die. She was found near a snowbank, seated, bleeding heavily, and barely conscious. She was rushed to hospital and underwent emergency surgery. She survived, a fact that, given the nature and number of her wounds, the medical staff who treated her found remarkable. Heath was arrested quickly. When investigators performed a forensic examination of her phone, the picture of what had truly happened became undeniable. Buffum was arrested shortly afterward. Heath pleaded guilty to attempted murder and agreed to testify against him. When she addressed the court at her sentencing, she said she had done everything for Buffum. She described him as her addiction. She apologized to Andrea Halverson directly. And then she said something that no one in that courtroom was likely to forget. "I won't beg for forgiveness," she told the court. "I don't deserve it." Buffum rejected a plea deal and went to trial, claiming insanity. The jury rejected that argument swiftly. He was convicted of accomplice to attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and criminal solicitation, and sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. Heath, in recognition of her cooperation and guilty plea, was sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2015. The case asks a question that has no comfortable answer. At what point does manipulation become an explanation, and at what point does it become an excuse? Samantha Heath was groomed from the age of 15 by a man who dismantled her independence piece by piece, who built her world around his wants, who eventually directed her hand toward another human being. All of that is true. It is also true that she drove to that park. She walked into those woods. She raised the knife. Andrea Halverson survived. She carries the physical and psychological scars of that day. She did not choose to be someone's obstacle. She was simply a friend, until someone decided that friendship was inconvenient and found a weapon willing enough to act on that decision. Paris Mayo neonaticide, Ross-on-Wye, Herefordshire, England, March 23, 2019. Life. Minimum 12 years. There are cases in true crime that demand more from us than simple judgment. Cases that sit at the intersection of tragedy and crime, where the questions they raise are not easily answered, and the people involved do not fit neatly into the categories we reach for. And then there are cases where, no matter how much compassion we try to extend, no matter how carefully we examine the circumstances that led to a particular moment, we are left confronting a single inescapable truth. A life was taken. A life that had no voice, no ability to defend itself, no say in the circumstances of its birth or its death. A life that lasted only minutes. His name was Stanley. On the night of March 23, 2019, 15-year-old Paris Mayo went into labor alone in the sitting room of her father's home in Ross-on-Wye, Herefordshire, England. Her mother was upstairs, helping her father, who was seriously ill and undergoing home dialysis, through his treatment. Her brother was elsewhere in the house. No one knew Paris was pregnant. She had concealed the pregnancy entirely, and the prosecution would later argue that the concealment was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was the product of a decision made long before that night. Paris gave birth alone, unaided, on the floor of the living room. The baby was a boy. She would name him Stanley. He was born alive. What happened in the minutes that followed was reconstructed by forensic medical experts and presented in detail at Worcester Crown Court. Stanley sustained complex fractures to his skull, injuries consistent with a foot being brought down upon his head. 5 pieces of cotton wool were forced into his mouth, 2 of them found deep in his throat during the post-mortem examination, blocking his airway. He was suffocated. His short life, the Crown Prosecution Service would later say in a statement, was filled with pain and suffering when it should have been filled with nurturing and love. When the act was complete, Paris placed Stanley's body inside a black bin bag, left it on the front doorstep of the house, sent a message to her older brother asking him to put it in the bin, and went to bed. It was Paris's mother who found the bag the following morning. Something about it disturbed her. She looked inside. The audio recording of the emergency call she made immediately afterward was played to the court. It was described by those present as harrowing. Paris Mayo's defense was built on denial. She told investigators she had not known she was pregnant. She said Stanley had been stillborn, that he was already dead when he came into the world, and that she had not killed him. The forensic evidence contradicted both claims directly. The medical injuries to Stanley's skull and the cotton wool found deep in his throat told a different story, one of deliberate, sequential action taken against a living infant. The prosecution argued that in the final hour before the birth, Paris had known what was happening to her body and had made a decision. Not a decision built over weeks or months, the judge would acknowledge, but a decision nonetheless. In those final minutes, he said, she had determined that the baby had to be dealt with. What the court also heard was the context in which Paris Mayo had carried this secret alone. Her father was gravely ill. He would die just 10 days after Stanley was born, the day before Paris's first police interview. Her defense argued that the weight of what she had done, combined with losing her father almost simultaneously, amounted to a life sentence of its own, regardless of what the court imposed. Her barrister described the time ahead of her as lonely, isolating, and frightening. He said it would, in every sense of the word, never truly end for her. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and 38 minutes before returning a majority guilty verdict of murder. They had been offered the option of returning a verdict of infanticide, a lesser charge that exists in English law specifically to account for the psychological disturbance that can accompany childbirth, but they declined it. The verdict was murder. On June 26, 2023, Paris Mayo, by then 19 years old, was sentenced to life detention with a minimum term of 12 years. She cried as the verdict was read, and cried again as she was led from the dock. The judge described the case as sad and terrible. He said that as difficult as her circumstances had been, what she had done to Stanley was a truly dreadful thing. She had a family, the prosecution noted, who would have supported her. She had a mother in the same house. She had chosen not to reach for any of them. Stanley Mayo lived for minutes. He will remain, in the record of English law and in the memory of the family that found him, forever the child who never got the chance to begin.